Again, geometry. Welcome to our next section, CG2 on the midpoint formula. We're going to be looking to find the midpoint, which is the halfway point between two endpoints on a segment. As we found out in our geometry basics unit, the midpoint bisects a segment into two congruent segments. So it splits this into two equal pieces. So we could use the distance formula from the last section to check to see, is this point in fact the halfway point? You could find the distance between that midpoint and this endpoint, and the midpoint and the other endpoint, and check that those distances are equal. But we're not going to focus on that bit of it today. We're going to focus on just finding the midpoint, and given the midpoint and one endpoint, finding the other endpoint. So here is a condensed version of the midpoint formula. Might look like a big mess if you haven't seen it before, but remember x1 and x2, these are just the x coordinates from our endpoints. So this is x1, this is x2 over here, and then the y1 and y2 are just the y coordinates of our endpoints. Another way to think of this is we're trying to find the halfway point, so this is the average of the x's, and this is the average of the y's. Average of the x's, the average of the y's, written as an ordered pair. So your answer for midpoint is always going to be an xy ordered pair, separated by a comma. Okay, average of your. So you could also, if we're in the mood to use subscripts, so this is m called the midpoint here, but you could also say this is x sub m, comma, y sub m. Okay, these are x coordinate of the midpoint and the y coordinate of the midpoint. So for an example, find the midpoint of the line segment with endpoints 1, -2, and -2, 7. We will find the average of our x's. So here's an x, so it's going to be 1 plus a -2 divided by 2. And then for our y's, here's a y, that -2 plus 7 over 2, and then we'll simplify. So 1 plus a -2 is a -1 over 2. -2 plus 7 is 5 over 2. And since -1 doesn't divide evenly by 2, 5 doesn't divide evenly by 2, you can actually leave your answer like this. Or you could simplify or divide to find a decimal. So -1 divided by 2 is -0.5. 5 divided by 2 is 2.5. Another one, find the midpoint of the line segment with endpoints -4, -4, and -2, -8. So once again, this is an x, this is a y, this is an x, this is a y. So the average of our x's, -4 plus a -2 divided by 2. -4 plus a -8 divided by 2, and we get -4 plus a -2 is a -6 over 2. -4 plus a -8 is a -12 over 2, and that simplifies to a -3, -6. Now, that worked out really nicely, and in fact, so nice that we could have done this without the formula if we're willing to do a little bit of mental math. So remember, the midpoint is just the halfway point. So if we're thinking, all right, what's halfway between -4 and -2? Well, just thinking on a number line, -4 and -2, the number right in between them is -3. The number halfway between -4 and -8 is -6. So we got -3, -6. So if the numbers are close together and they're an even number of, they're an even number of units apart, you can have a nice halfway point. On number 5, on this next example, we're going to, actually those are, 3, 4, 5. We didn't have a 1 or a 2, did we? So on example 5, find the missing endpoint of the line segment with endpoint -2, -4, and midpoint -9, 0. Okay, so here we can use the midpoint formula, and since we find the average of our x's to find our x coordinate of our midpoint, we can say, we could write an equation that says that x1 plus x2 over 2 equals the x coordinate of our midpoint. So if this is one of our endpoints, maybe this would be my x1 and y1, and the midpoint is negative 9, 0. So negative 1 or negative 2 is our x, so we could say, actually we'll use x2 and y2 just because it ends up looking nicer when we're solving. So x1 plus negative 2 divided by 2 equals negative 9. So to solve this, we can multiply both sides by 2. Then those cancel out, and x1 plus a negative 2, or plus a negative 2 is the same as just minus 2, equals negative 18. Then we can add 2, x1 equals negative 16. And we'll do the same thing with our y's. y1 plus our other y endpoint, negative 4, over 2 equals 0. So multiply both sides by 2 to get y1 minus 4 equals 0. 0 times 2 is still 0. Add 4, and y1 equals 4. So the other endpoint is the coordinate negative 16, 4. Negative 16, 4. Now, I want to show you a kind of a quicker and easier way to think about this. And we can use some mental math, kind of like this one here. We can find the halfway point pretty easily if the numbers are nice. Well, finding the other endpoint is actually as simple as making a table. So since we're going to have, to get from one endpoint to the other, so this point here, we have to go 3 units to get to our midpoint, 1, 2, 3. We have to go another 3 units to get to our other endpoint, 1, 2, 3. Same thing for the y's. I have to go up 2 to get to that midpoint. I have to go up another 2 to get to the other endpoint. So if I know what one of the endpoints is, negative 2, negative 4, and I know that the midpoint is at negative 9, 0, to find my other endpoint, I can make a little table here. And to get from negative 2 to negative 9, I have to go down 7. So then I just go down another 7 to get to negative 16. To get from negative 4 to 0, I have to go up 4. So if I continue that, go up another 4, I get to positive 4. Okay? So you can make a table to see how far do I have to go to get from my endpoint to my midpoint, and then I just go another amount of that same unit to get to my other endpoint. Okay? So you can use the equation version, or we can use the table version. Okay? So let me know if you have any questions. We'll talk more about this in class. See you then.